this is the lay of the land for Southern Ontario. And one thing we all have in common in 1634, all of us, is we're all engaged with the fur trade. All of us. We trade with other people, but for example, all these folks that I'm circling with my cursor now, we're all trading with the French. You know, they set up places in Montreal, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and so on, up and down the St. Lawrence River. They wanted to catch the pesky beavers so that they could have fur hats in France. Down below, the Haudenosaunee folks, in what becomes New York State, were also engaged in the fur trade, only they're trading with the Dutch. Okay, they're in control of that area of land back in 1634. So we're all engaged in this fur trade. And believe me, the fur trade leads to a tremendous amount of conflict among the First Nations groups. When I think about the 17th century, or if you will, the 1600s, I think of the time of the Beaver Wars. The whole region you see here on this map was engaged in intermittent warfare amongst each other. We're all fighting to stay in control of the fur trade, all of us. We want to keep trading with the French, the Haudenosaunee want to keep trading with the Dutch, and then later with the British. They're running short of furs. People in Southern Ontario have furs. There's some invasions back and forth. There's really nasty warfare. But when the dust clears, about 1700, all these nations have been dispossessed from their lands. The Mississaugas moved down into this area, and well, the landscape changes in terms of the First Nations here. So the period of the Beaver Wars end with the Mississaugas taking control of the western end of Lake Ontario. Now, that's a whole other story of the Beaver Wars. We can talk about that some other time, but we're kind of limited for time today. But in 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal, it's known as, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation control land from the Rouge River west to the headwaters of the Thames River, follow the Thames River down all the way to Lake Erie, Long Point, all the way around Niagara River, then once again all the way back to the Rouge River. About 4 million acres of land, about, give or take. And you'll see I've marked several of our rivers here because we're a water people. Matter of fact, many people say that's how we got our name, Mississauga. It resembles an Ojibwe word that means people that live at the mouths of many rivers. Well, we did when we moved into Southern Ontario. If you'd suddenly be transported back in time a couple hundred years and you would visit these rivers, you would find our wigwams perched on the flats of rivers and creeks flowing into Lake Ontario. And our principal river was the Credit River, number 4 here. We called it the Nissinihie, but it later becomes known as the Credit River, and we become known as the Mississaugas of the Credit. Anyway, we move into Southern Ontario and we carry on the fur trade, first with the French and then with the British. Now, the great thing about the French is the great thing about them is all that they were really interested in was our furs, our pelts, whether it was beavers and whether it was bear or moose hides, whatever. They were interested in pelts. They did not require land. If they wanted land, it was either for a chapel, so a religious establishment, space for a church, or they wanted to set up a trading post somewhere. They did not want to occupy land. And that's something very different that comes with the British. The British, in 1759, I'm sure you remember back from your elementary school history, Battle of the Plains of Abraham, they beat the French outside the walls of Quebec City. A year later, they beat the French at Montreal. The French are no longer a serious entity, colonial power, no longer a serious colonial power in North America. And Britain becomes responsible for much of North America. And that's what begins the treaty-making age for us today in the lands around Halton. So that's our focus this afternoon, treaty making. Now, treaties, I'll point this out right now. Nothing new to First Nations people. We've been making them for years, long before the settlers arrived. long before Christopher Columbus or Giovanni Caboto or Jacques Cartier. We were making treaties between ourselves. A treaty, by definition, is nothing more than a negotiated agreement between nations, and it's usually formalized in some way. Back before the settlers arrived, we used to memorialize our treaties in wampum belts. These are simply just belts made out of shells, woven together, and we weave the terms of our treaties right into the belt. This belt is called the Iroquois Ojibwe Friendship Belt. One square represents the Ojibwe people, the other square represents the Haudenosaunee people, and the path between them is clear, that they can communicate with each other, and we promise to have open communication between ourselves or among ourselves. So that's how we used to do it in the old days. Later, when the British come and we start entering into complicated treaties involving land, we memorialize our treaties on paper. And this is actually a treaty excerpt of a treaty from Halton region. This is the Brant Tract Treaty of 1797. You know, our treaties usually include a map of the area being discussed, the signatories of the treaty from the Crown end, or the British perspective, and it also includes the names of our chiefs and their dotems, the symbols they use to signify their clans. Not only signifies the assent of the chiefs that they agreed to the treaty, but it also signifies that the clan people led by them give assent to the treaties. And here you have an eagle, and here's an otter, and here is a deer or a buffalo. I'm not 100% sure yet, but the treaty making ways of memorializing the treaties change. So we already talked about how the French did not want our land. Well, that changes with the British, but we do have one rather large treaty. The British take over North America, or much of North America, and all of a sudden they have this vast landscape that they have to administer, all the way from Florida, all the way up, you know, to the Arctic Ocean type, or to the Hudson Bay and Arctic Ocean. So they have to have rules to administer the land, and part of those rules come to us in the terms of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And that was the way the British set out rules for acquiring land from First Nations people. It wasn't going to be like in the United States, or what becomes the United States. Settlers can just go out, meet with every individual Indian band and make a deal and acquire land. That wasn't going to happen in British-held occupation, in British-held land. Only the Crown could acquire land from First Nations, only the Crown, only the British government. And, you know, this acquisition of land could only be held at a public meeting with the band, and it could only be negotiated by the Crown. So there were certain rules for land acquisition. And so that's all well and fine. And what we really like the Royal Proclamation for, at least we do among First Nations people, is that they recognized each individual First Nation as a nation. They recognized that, for example, the Mississaugas of the Credit were the sovereign, I don't like the term owners, but I'll say the sovereign people over the lands they occupied in southern Ontario. And that was the same wherever you were. The British decided on these rules, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 for land acquisition. So a year later, 1764, there was a massive meeting of 24 First Nations from around the Great Lakes at Niagara, in which there was 24 First Nations represented, 2,000 First Nations leaders, and we met with the British Crown representative, Sir William Johnson. And basically, we all got together and agreed that we would follow the terms of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and that we would coexist together as friends and allies on the land. Neither one of us was going anywhere on the land. And so here is a memorial belt given to us by Sir William Johnson, extended to the 24 First Nations. And here's what it signifies. Notice two figures. representing an indigenous person, the other person representing the crown, and they're both together holding hands. Neither figure is greater in stature or lesser in stature. They're both the same. They're both holding hands in friendship, peace. We're allies and we're friends. And the date of the treaty, 1764 in there. Remember, we love to remember the terms of our treaties, weave them right into terms of the wampum belts. And so here it is, friends and allies. We're both living together on the land, and we ratified that Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, the joke here at New Credit, and probably other First Nations as well, how do you tell the British figure from the Indigenous figure or the First Nations figure? Well, we say around here we can tell the British figure because he has a black heart. Now, that's a joke amongst us here, and I'm certain other First Nations too, but it kind of reflects, it's kind of a bittersweet joke because the treaty making process did not go well for our people. And you'll find out why in the next few moments. So what really begins the treaty making process off in earnest is that nasty thing called the American Revolution. I'm sure you remember back in school, 13 colonies, British colonies along the eastern seaboard of the United States. They're more or less self-governing. They have their own legislative assemblies and things like that. But they still have to take orders from across the pond, Great Britain, the British Parliament, and King George III. Well, eventually those colonists get annoyed with taking orders from George III in the British Parliament, and they decide to throw off the British yoke and govern themselves. And that whole conflict is called the American Revolution. Starts in 1876, if I'm not mistaken. Well, that's a problem because there's many people in those colonies that want to remain loyal to George III. And still, we call them loyalists even to this day. They want to remain loyal to King George III. They don't mind taking the orders from Britain. Well, they were a minority. Many of the American colonists were rebelling openly against the king. And so as they take hold in what becomes the United States, they start to do nasty things to loyalists. They throw them in jail, they confiscate their property, they tar and feather them, quite literally, all kinds of nasty things. So many of the loyalists have to flee north, because if they can flee north, the British Crown has promised them land. So if they can get north where they're safe, outside of the American colonies, in the Maritimes perhaps, or above Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, the British Crown will grant these loyalists land, farming equipment, whatever they needed to get their lives started again in what becomes Canada eventually. So the very first treaty made by the British Crown comes in the midst of the American Revolution. It's for this little strip of land here along the Niagara River. They came to the Mississaugas of the Credit Ancestors and listen, we need to be farther west, British troops farther west, we'd like to acquire that land. And we said, yes, and you'll never guess what the British paid for. They paid us 300 British red coats. Now, I like British red coats. I think they're kind of fashionable. And either way, I think we thought they were fashionable too. So we accept the 300 British coats and we go on our way. The British, the man that negotiated the deal, Sir Guy Johnson, jokes to his friends, listen, I didn't really pay the Mississaugas that much for that land. Matter of fact, I was going to give them the coats anyway, just for staying by our side during the conflict with the rebels. So he thought he was pulling a fast one over us, but for our people, it really meant that the British recognized the Mississaugas of the Credit as the rightful occupants of the lands at the western end of Lake Ontario. It meant that according to the terms of the Royal Proclamation, if they were going to acquire more land, they would be coming to our First Nation. So now, Halton. I love Halton. Halton Region, you are the all-time record holders for having treaties with our First Nation. There's not another municipality, upper tier, lower tier, that holds as many treaties with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Your treaty partners par excellence, if you will. And so you'll see the 5 treaties. Now you can kind of see, here's Halton again here, but in this map here, I've just simply cut out the Halton region and overlapped it on the treaty areas. So 5 treaties: the Adjutant's Treaty, the Head of the Lake Treaty, Between the Lakes Treaty, Brant Tract Treaty, and Treaty number 22. So 5 treaties. So I'm going to take each treaty in turn and tell you how they came about. And sometimes we'll spend a little bit of time on them. Sometimes we don't have to spend a lot of time on them. So the very first treaty we're going to look at is for this purplish patch here. That is our Between the Lakes Treaty. Also comes about as a direct result of the American Revolution. Notice it says 1792 here. That's when the treaty was ratified, but it was originally negotiated in 1784, and it was negotiated for a very special bunch of loyalists. The Haudenosaunee people had fought for the British during the American Revolution. You might know them as the Iroquois. Back then, they were known as the 5 Nations of the Iroquois. Nowadays, they're known as the 6 Nations of the Iroquois. So you might hear them referred to that because they are much in the news. But in any case, they had fought for the British during the American Revolution. And when the British lose that conflict, many of the Haudenosaunee, or the 6 Nations, lose their land base. So they come to the governor at the time, Frederick Halton. He's the governor of what becomes this region of land. And they ask him for a strip of land that they might have because they had lost their homes fighting for the British Crown. And Frederick Halton says, yes, go out and select the land that you would like. So Joseph Brant, he's the leader of the Confederacy, Mohawk war chief. He selects a strip of land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its mouth to its head, all the way up here. And he goes back to Frederick Halton and he says, this is the land we'd like. Can we have it? And Frederick Halton says, well, I think you can, but I must first go to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and talk to them because it's their lands. And so he comes to us, meets us in 1784, and we agree to treat for this entire block of land outlined in red that you see here. We call that our Between the Lakes Treaty. It's about, give or take, 3 million acres of land. And we engage in that treaty knowing that they will move the Haudenosaunee loyalists in this piece of land here. This piece of land is called the Haldeman Tract or the Haldeman Deed lands. So we engage in that treaty, and in 1784, the Haudenosaunee and Joseph Brant move in and occupy this strip of land. So that's the first treaty that the Halton region engages in with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So other loyalists moved in outside of this tract, but our First Nation mainly remembers this treaty because it meant that the 6 Nations moved back into the lands of Southern Ontario. So that's the very first treaty. The second treaty also has to do really with Halton region, but it's a much smaller tract of land. It basically covers Burlington, about, 3,450 acres of land. Oh, pardon me, I forgot to tell you how much the British Crown paid for the land in the Between the Lakes Treaty. So for this tract of land here, for about 3 million acres of land, the British Crown paid 1,100 pounds. Okay, 1,100 pounds. So here we are back in Burlington, about 3,450 acres of land. And this land was acquired by the British to grant to Mohawk war chief Joseph Brant. He had been an outstanding warrior fighting on behalf of the British Crown. He was a tremendous leader, and the Crown wanted to reward him personally for his loyalty. So he wanted a strip of land on present-day Burlington. And you can see the extent of that land here in the red outline. Okay, and you can see the major highways that flow through it right now. So in 1795, pardon me, 1795, negotiations are entered upon, and Joseph Brant is granted that land. Not very big, but nevertheless, it's ratified in 1797. Also within the Halton region of Halton, pardon me. So the second treaty with Halton, both of them born out of the American Revolution. Okay. Matter of fact, three now born out of the American Revolution: the Niagara Purchase, the Between the Lakes Purchase, and now the Brant Tract. And now things start getting a little complicated. So you have these large treaty areas now. When we entered into those early treaties, I blush to say it nowadays because we've grown up significantly in the last couple hundred years. But back then, we did not know what we were entering into. The British came to us thinking that they were purchasing land from us. That much like a modern real estate deal, I'm sure many of you folks know how that works. You buy a piece of land, it's yours. You can do whatever you want with it as long as you're not violating some bylaw somewhere. It's pretty much yours what to do. You own it in fee simple, as they say. Well, the Mississaugas and many indigenous groups across Canada, we do not have a concept of land ownership. We occupy it, we steward it, we possess it, we do all kinds of things with it, but we don't say we own it. Matter of fact, we might be tempted to say the land owns us. If anything, we belong to the land. So we don't have that concept of ownership. We partake of the land, we use its resources. Like I said, we steward along and try and live wisely on the land. And so, you know, it's a much different concept of landholding. And when we entered into those early treaties that we've talked to thus far, the Brant Tract, the Between the Lakes and Niagara Purchase, we thought we were sharing the lands with the settlers. Sure, they would come and move in, and they would build some villages, and they would establish some farms. We kind of knew that, but we thought that we would be able to carry on our traditional lifestyle, that we would still hunt, fish, gather, trap, trade. Our lives would still go on as they had done for centuries. We were to be mistaken, because those two concepts of landholding just don't mesh together. When one side, the Crown side, the British side, the settler side says we own, and the other group says we share, those two concepts of land tenure simply don't work. And so we run into problems, and many of Canada's problems, current problems today, with First Nations and treaties and land claims date back to that misunderstanding. So, like I said, the treaties, at least the early ones that we've discussed thus far, for the Crown, they encompass land ownership. The treaties always encompass a land description and some form of compensation. For example, the Brant Tract treaty that you saw was granted to Joseph Brant, 1,100 pounds. For the Between the Lakes treaty, like I said, about 1,180 pounds. And in the Niagara Treaty, 300 British coats. For First Nations, though, we entered into an agreement to share the land. The treaties, and you can examine them, they're all online. They do not take away these things: the right to self-determination, the right to stewardship, the right to harvest, and the right to be sustained by our lands, waters, and resources. You will look in vain in any of our treaties, and we got 8 of them with the Crown, that take away any of those things. Matter of fact, you'll look pretty hard for any treaty right that we acquire out of these agreements. Okay, you look pretty hard. There's one exception that I'll note later. But for the most part, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, we talk about indigenous or inherent rights. We don't spend a lot of time, even today, the 21st century, talking about treaty rights. So we were very surprised when we started to move about the land, carrying on our hunting, our fishing and gathering, and we suddenly found our ways of doing things drastically changed. The settlers move in, they plow the fields, they fence in areas, they chop down the forests, they clear the field. Well, they have to, they have to farm. All of a sudden you're inundated with 30,000 loyalists and things change. Your traditional economy collapses. But we thought we were sharing, but suddenly it seemed as if we weren't sharing anymore. And so that becomes very, very problematic to us. And we finally start expressing our surprise with this Halton Treaty. This is what we call the head of the Lake Treaty, negotiated in 1805, but ratified in 1806. We call it Treaty number 14. Sometimes you might hear it talked about as Treaty 13A, but according to the Government of Canada, it is Treaty 14, and we recognize it as Treaty 14. So it's a strip of land 6 miles deep from the shoreline all the way back, six miles deep, and encompasses land from Toronto area all the way to Joseph Brant tract lands here. It's about 73,000 acres of land, and the British wanted this land to join the settlements all around Lake Ontario together. Good for military purposes, good for communication purposes, just good policy for settlement in general. And so they wanted to do that. And so they came to our people in 1805. Now, I'm just going to back up a map here. Now, they come to us in 1805, August 2nd, 1805. Guess what? The day before, August 1801, they completed with the Mississaugas of the Credit the Toronto Purchase Treaty. This orange blotch of land that you see here is the Toronto Purchase Treaty. The day before we agreed to that treaty, and the next day the Crown comes back to us and negotiates this head of the lake treaty, this olive-looking color that you see here. Okay, so right the day after, and this time we're surprised that he comes back to us the day after and asks for more land. And we express our displeasure to Colonel Claus. He's the Crown negotiator, because things were not going so well for us. We finally clued in to the value of land and that we were not sharing the land any longer. We said to Colonel Claus when he comes to us the day after the Toronto Purchase Treaty, "Father, we are very much surprised that you come for more land. Father, why is this? When you ask us for land, we have cheerfully given it to you. Now we try and move about the land as we'd once done, as we once did, and the farmers drive us away from our camping spots. They shoot our dogs, and they do not give us any assistance like you promised us. Father, why are we so ill-treated?" And ill-treated we were, and this was just not, the chief expressing, a bunch of mumbo-jumbo to gain bargaining power with the Crown. We were in dire straits with those early treaties and the settlers moving in and inundating us. Our fields plowed up, the game driven away, the fish stocks being used. Our traditional economy collapses. We can't carry on life as we'd always done, and our population begins to decline. When we started the treaty making process, all that 4 million acres I showed you of our territory, there was only 500 Mississaugas of the credit. We moved about in a seasonally migrant way. We moved about our lands. Well, 10 years into the treaty making process, 1790s, about the time of the Brant Tract purchase, we're down to 400. By the time the Toronto purchase is completed in 1805 and negotiations begin the next day for the Heather Lake purchase, we're down to 300 people. Not only has our traditional lifestyle collapsed and we can't feed ourselves and look after ourselves according to our ways, we get hit with diseases that are not deadly at all by any means nowadays, but back then were awful. Tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, things like that. They come and hit us and we have no cure for them. And so our population is diminishing and rapidly. So Chief Quinnipiac, when he's talking to Colonel Claus at the head of the Lake Treaty, listen, why are we being so ill-treated, Father? He's looking at what has become really a nightmarish scenario. Our people are dispirited, they're disheartened. And matter of fact, he tells Colonel Claus, our young men and women are very disheartened that you want more land. They say that if we give you more land, we will even be more impoverished and feeble than we already are. Nevertheless, the deal was made, and so that is how Halton, gets the strip of land along Lake Erie. The great thing we did negotiate in the treaty was these blank spaces that you see here, 12 Mile Creek, 16 Mile Creek, and the Credit River. We reserved those as fisheries for ourselves, the sole right of fishing, because we knew we were people that lived off salmon. The salmon provided much in the way of sustenance for our people. We could still at least fish the salmon, so we kept them for ourselves. So at least we had some foresight there. But really, we're in serious problems here at 300 of us. Well, the War of 1812 comes and goes. The Mississaugas of the Credit fight on behalf of the British Crown and help to repel the Americans. Our people fought at Detroit and Niagara-on-the-Lake, and of course the Battle of York, that's our biggie. And so the war comes and goes. We fight, we lose men, our population is still diminishing. About mid-1815 or so, we're down to about 200 of us left. So you can see where this is going. We're still struggling to feed ourselves. We can't move about the land that we once had to. And Colonel Claus comes to us again. Let's go back a little bit for this brown stretch of land, or this bluish stretch of land. That's for the northern region of Halton. We call it the Adjutant's Treaty. It's about 650,000 acres worth of land. Colonel Claus comes to our people and he says to us, I see your children. They look thin and miserable. And you have a large tract of land lying unused. Why don't you give it into the hands of your great father, and we will make good use of it? And of course, we were in dire straits. We couldn't feed ourselves. Traditional economies collapsed. We're disease-ridden. Like, I can't emphasize how desperate we were. And Colonel Claus promised that if we would agree to part with this land, he would give us 522 pounds worth of goods every year for maintenance, and that's the words he used, maintenance and religious education. That is how the Crown would look after us. So an annuity, 522 pounds a year to keep body and soul together, and they would provide us for a religion education. And so our chief at the time, James Adjutants, that's his name, that's who the treaty is named after, by the way, Adjutants, agrees to that treaty. So we are to get 522 pounds, and hopefully that will keep us alive for a bit longer. So there's the text of the treaty. Now, the only thing that adjutants asks of Colonel Claus is that, let's go back here a little bit, let's go back here even a little bit more, that we reserve our fisheries once again and our credit river lands. But we tell Colonel Claus we won't have them much longer because, like I said, we thought we were going to be extinct. The Crown thought we were going to be extinct. It was only a matter of time. But, you know, the Crown comes to us again 2 years after the Adjutants Treaty, and they come to us asking for our fisheries. This is Treaty 22 and 23. 23 is for this block of land here. You don't have to worry about that in Halton region. But in Halton region, you have to worry about these two blocks of lands, our fishery here, Treaty 22. Colonel Claus comes to us. He wants those lands as well. He tells us that the Americans are coming upon the land, the settlers are coming upon the land, they're very thick. And why don't we give those lands into our very great Father, and he will protect them for us and hold them for us. And if he will sell the land, some of the lands, and use that money, once again, for maintenance and religious education. We agree, we're in desperate straits once again. 522 pounds that we're getting from our annuity from the adjutant's purchase isn't doing much to keep body and soul together. It's very meager. Meager gruel, so to speak, for us. But anyway, so we agree to those treaties. And that's the last of our fisheries. That's the last of our lands. Matter of fact, it's not quite the last. I should be a little bit more honest with you. It's the last of our lands, except for 200 acres up here by the Credit River. 208 acres. If you're a mathematician and you're keeping track of math right now, you've seen we went from 4 million acres of land to 200 acres of land. Boy, that's awful. And you can see, you can probably understand why things collapsed the way they did. So very, very sorry state. Eventually, we find a way, and that's another story for another day, out of our predicament. We become Christian farmers or Christian agriculturalists, and we move into a mission village, the Credit River Mission Village at the Mississauga Golf and Country Club, where it stands now. We move in there and really transform our lives into the abject poverty and desperation we were experiencing to the First Nation that we've become today. So, but that's a story for another time. In terms of this particular treaty, Treaty 22, you'll notice this was a trust. We gave our lands into trust to the Crown. They would sell the lands and then use the money they gained from selling the lands and use it for the benefit of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Well, sad thing is, we lost track of the records. There is no accounting of how the money was spent and given to the First Nations. None at all. So now there is a claim submitted before the federal government to this very day, asking for an accounting of the funds and of the land sold and so on. So we'll see where it goes with that. These claims take a long time to settle. We'll be settling in for the long haul here. It might take us upwards of 20 some odd years to handle that. So still some dispute in the Oakville lands, even to this very day. So I want to stop talking a little bit, but treaty making. A few years ago, we were all treaty people. It seemed to be on the lips of everybody. Then it faded away again. And then with the nasty stories coming out of Kelowna and the residential school there, and of course, since that uncovering of those unmarked graves, there's been a lot more things raised in the press about the plight of Indigenous people, First Nations people across Canada. And once again, we're beginning to think terms of reconciliation and recognition as the First Nations people as treaty partners on the land. Settlements in Hamilton, Guelph, St. Catharines, Niagara, Kitchener-Waterloo, these are all lands, Oakville, Mississauga, Toronto, all lands established on the Mississaugas of the Credit lands. And yet, we are not recognized necessarily. Many of you probably sitting here today did not realize that we are the treaty partners in the relationship. And as treaty partners, we still expect to live up to our end of the treaties that we would enter in to a partnership, a sharing agreement. And we know how that's worked out. But I have hope for reconciliation. And that's in this two-row wampum belt here. And this is not a belt that's natural to our First People or native to our people. It comes to us from the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, but many of the Great Lakes tribes around the Great Lakes have adopted it as a symbol for Crown Indigenous relationships. This two-row wampum, this one purple strand signifies a settler ship. And the other purple strand represents, where it is here, represents an Indigenous canoe or First Nations canoe. We're both going down the river in parallel. The settlers in one path, the First Nations and other folks, we're in parallel. We're not interfering with each other. We're not like I said, interfering in each other's lives. But we know that's not true. We've interfered in each other's lives plenty. Canadian history tells us that, for good or for ill. Okay, so the toothpaste is out of the tube. You can't put it back in. We are pretty much interacting with each other every day. But I love these white beads. These white beads, you see there's three of them separating the two purple strands, represent peace, respect, and friendship. People ask me nowadays, what does reconciliation mean? And you know what? I say, I don't know. I really don't. But I do know reconciliation, or at least two people living together in harmony and peace and friendship, like that treaty belt I showed you earlier as partners on the land. If we're going to reconcile ourselves and try and get to that state, if we can talk to each other in peace, respect, and friendship, reconciliation will come organically from the ground up amongst the people at our end, at the bottom of the hierarchy, just the common citizens. It won't come from the top down, the government down. It's going to have to be us moving reconciliation up the food chain, so to speak. And the only way we can do that is by talking to each other with peace, respect, and friendship. And that's why today talks like I have with you folks today, at least you get a chance to hear where First Nations people come from.